Fatal Silence at Willowmere Lake, a Miss Marple mystery. Come closer, dear listener, and let us leave the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead for a moment, just far enough to reach the still waters of Willowmere Lake. It is a place cherished for its calm, a lake bordered by reeds and willow trees, where the surface lies so smooth that it seems to swallow sound itself. Villagers come here to think, to walk, to escape the small frictions of daily life. Silence, after all, can feel like peace. But silence can also conceal. On a quiet afternoon when the air hangs heavy and the water barely stirs, a body is discovered at the lake's edge. There are no signs of struggle, no raised voices remembered, no witnesses eager to speak, only a stillness so complete it feels deliberate. At first, the village accepts the simplest explanation: an accident, a misstep, a tragedy best left unquestioned. Miss Jane Marple, however, has never trusted silence. She notices what others overlook, the way people avoid certain paths, the hesitation before answering ordinary questions, the tension beneath polite sympathy. And as she listens, patterns begin to emerge, not of noise or chaos, but of restraint, of words carefully withheld, of truths deliberately left unsaid. Because some crimes are not committed in anger, they are committed in quiet agreement. As Miss Marple begins to untangle the relationships surrounding Willowmere Lake, she discovers that the most dangerous thing in the village is not what was done, but what everyone decided not to say. So settle in, watch the water, listen to the pauses between words. For in the stillness of Willowmere Lake, a fatal silence has already spoken. Chapter 1. The Body by the Water. Willowmere Lake lay perfectly still beneath the afternoon sky. The water reflected the pale clouds so clearly that it was difficult to tell where sky ended and lake began. Reeds whispered softly at the edges, bending just enough to suggest movement without disturbing the surface. Willow trees drooped gracefully over the shoreline, their long branches skimming the water like idle fingers. It was a place villagers described as peaceful. Miss Marple thought it felt watchful. She had come at the invitation of Mrs. Ellery, a distant acquaintance who lived in the nearby village, and had written with some urgency. The letter had been carefully worded, no accusations, no drama, but the unease between the lines had been unmistakable. An unfortunate discovery, Mrs. Ellery had written. The bank sloped gently here, not steep enough to explain a sudden fall, especially not for a man as cautious as Leonard Foyle. "Was he alone?" Miss Marple asked softly. "As far as anyone knows," Mrs. Ellery replied. "He often walked here." "Did anyone see him arrive?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ellery hesitated. "Not exactly. Inspector Graves arrived moments later, his expression already familiar with this sort of gathering. "Miss Marple," he said, unsurprised. "I had a feeling you might be nearby."
"Habit," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "It saves time."
Graves surveyed the body. No signs of violence. No water in the lungs, surprisingly. Miss Marple looked up sharply.
"No water?"
"Not enough to suggest drowning," Graves said, "which is odd."
"Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Very."
Dr. Harris, the local physician, confirmed the preliminary assessment. "Heart failure is possible. Foyle wasn't young." "But he was careful," Miss Marple said. Dr. Harris nodded. "Yes, painfully so." Leonard Foyle had been known in the village for his reserve. A widower, meticulous in his habits, punctual to a fault, he avoided conflict, avoided gossip, avoided anything that might invite attention. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, he had ended up here.
"Did Mr. Foyle seem troubled recently?" Miss Marple asked quietly.
There was a pause. Mrs. Ellery glanced at another woman nearby, then back again.
"He had concerns."
"About what?" Miss Marple asked.
"About things best left alone,"
Mrs. Ellery replied. Miss Marple straightened slowly. Inspector Graves knelt near the body and examined Foyle's hands. "No defensive marks," he said.
"And no sign he fell in." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the lake. The water was too calm, too undisturbed. A man slipping would have left something behind, a ripple remembered, a branch snapped, a reed bent out of place. But Willowmere Lake appeared as though it had not noticed Leonard Foyle at all. Miss Marple walked a few steps along the shoreline. Near a willow trunk she noticed something small and pale against the dark soil. A handkerchief, folded, dry. She picked it up carefully.
"Is this his?"
she asked Mrs. Ellery. Mrs. Ellery peered at it.
"Yes, he always carried one."
"Always folded so neatly?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ellery's lips pressed together.
"Yes."
Miss Marple nodded. "Too neat."
Later, as the body was prepared for removal, villagers lingered, reluctant to leave, yet unwilling to speak freely. Miss Marple listened.
Fragments drifted past her. "He knew too much. Shouldn't have gone to the lake. Quiet man, but stubborn." "Stubborn." Miss Marple returned her gaze to the water. Silence, she knew, was not empty. It was full of choices, of decisions made and unmade, of truths swallowed before they could surface. Leonard Foyle had not died accidentally. Not here. Not like this. As the sun lowered and the lake darkened, Miss Marple remained behind, her eyes fixed on the still water. Someone had relied on silence, and Willowmere Lake, obedient as ever, had kept it. Chapter 1. Call to Action. Do you believe Leonard Foyle's death was staged to look like an accident? Or is the lake hiding something else entirely? Share your theory below. Chapter 2. The Things Not Said. In the days following Leonard Foyle's death, Willowmere Lake became a place people avoided without admitting they were doing so. Paths that once echoed with morning footsteps lay empty. Fishermen chose other waters. Even children, usually fearless in their curiosity, were quietly steered away by anxious parents. Silence had settled over the village, not the peaceful sort, but the kind that felt negotiated. Miss Marple noticed immediately. She walked through the village the next morning, greeting acquaintances with her usual mild warmth. Polite responses were offered,
But conversations ended quickly. Doors closed a little too firmly. Curtains shifted at windows. People were watching. At the small grocer's shop, she encountered Mrs. Ellery again, standing rigidly at the counter as she waited for her change. "It's strange," Miss Marple said casually, "how places change after a death." Mrs. Ellery nodded too quickly. "Everyone's been rather shaken." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "though some seem more shaken than others." Mrs. Ellery glanced around before lowering her voice. "Leonard wasn't liked." "Disliked?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No," Mrs. Ellery corrected. "Feared." That was interesting. Later that morning, Inspector Graves met Miss Marple near the lakeside path. "We've checked his home," he said. "Nothing missing. No sign of a struggle. He left exactly as he always did." "And returned?" Miss Marple asked. Graves shook his head. "That's the trouble." Leonard Foyle's cottage stood neat and undisturbed, the bed neatly made, the kettle cold, his walking stick resting by the door, unused. "He didn't expect to need it," Miss Marple murmured. Graves raised an eyebrow.
Meaning? "Meaning he expected to walk," she said, "not to fall."
They continued toward the lake, stopping where the body had been found. "Anyone seen with him that day?" Miss Marple asked. "A few," Graves said. "Nothing suspicious." "Who?" Miss Marple pressed. "Mr. Harold Keene passed him near the footbridge. Mrs. Porter saw him walking alone later, and Miss Ruth Carver spoke with him briefly." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Ruth Carver?" "Yes," Graves replied. "Schoolteacher. Recently returned to the village." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That afternoon she paid a visit to Miss Carver. The woman answered the door with visible reluctance. She was in her early 30s, composed but tense, her movements controlled. "I wondered if we might talk," Miss Marple said kindly. Miss Carver hesitated, then stepped aside. "If you must." They sat in a small sitting room, sunlight filtering through thin curtains. "You saw Mr. Foyle on the day he died," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," Miss Carver replied. "Briefly." "About what?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Carver's hands tightened in her lap. "He asked me to leave him alone." "That seems unusually firm," Miss Marple said. "He could be very insistent," Miss Carver replied. "He didn't like being reminded." "Reminded of what?" Miss Marple asked softly. Miss Carver stood abruptly. "I've told you all I know." Miss Marple rose as well, not pressing the point. Outside, she paused by the gate. Leonard Foyle had not been liked. He had been feared. Later that evening, Miss Marple joined a small gathering at Mrs. Porter's home. Tea was served, conversation carefully neutral. Eventually, someone spoke what others avoided.
"Leonard had threatened to speak," Mrs. Porter said quietly. "Speak about what?" Miss Marple asked. "About the lake," Mrs. Porter replied. Miss Marple looked up. "The lake?" "There were arrangements," Mrs. Porter said. "Long-standing ones." Silence followed. Miss Marple did not rush it. "He said he would no longer keep quiet," Mrs. Porter continued, "that he'd had enough." "And did anyone believe him?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Porter shook her head. "We thought he wouldn't dare." Miss Marple folded her hands. The lake was not merely a setting. It was a secret, a shared one, and Leonard Foyle had chosen to break the silence. That night Miss Marple returned alone to Willowmere Lake. The water reflected the moon faintly, rippling only when a fish surfaced. She walked slowly along the bank until she reached the spot where Leonard Foyle had been found. She crouched and examined the ground again. Near the willow tree she noticed something she had overlooked before, a faint scuff mark, partially erased by time and careful feet. Not a struggle, a pause. Two people had stood here, facing each other. Miss Marple straightened. Leonard Foyle had not slipped. He had stopped. To listen, to argue, or to be persuaded into silence permanently. The lake remained still, but the village, Miss Marple knew, was full of people who had learned to say nothing, and one of them had finally decided that silence was worth killing for. Call to action. Who do you think feared Leonard Foyle the most, and why? Share your theory below.
Chapter 3. Agreements by the Water. Miss Marple had long believed that shared secrets created communities more tightly than shared values ever could. They bound people together not through affection, but through fear, the fear that if one spoke, all would suffer. Willowmere Lake, she now understood, was such a secret. The morning after her discovery of the scuff marks by the willow tree, Miss Marple set about learning who, precisely, had reason to fear Leonard Foyle's voice. She began with Mr. Harold Keene. He lived alone in a narrow cottage overlooking the eastern path to the lake, a retired civil engineer with a reputation for precision and reserve. He answered the door politely, but with visible reluctance. "I heard you saw Leonard on the day he died," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes," Keene replied, briefly. "Where?" Miss Marple asked. "Near the footbridge," he said. "We exchanged greetings." "And nothing more?" Miss Marple pressed. Keene hesitated. "He said he was going to the lake." "Did that surprise you?" Miss Marple asked. Keene's jaw tightened. "Leonard did things at inconvenient times." "Such as?" Miss Marple asked. Keene sighed, asking questions. Miss Marple thanked him and left, noting the way his eyes followed her until she turned the corner. Next, she visited Mrs. Porter. The woman's hospitality was generous but brittle. She poured tea quickly, avoided eye contact, and spoke with a careful cheerfulness that convinced no one. "Leonard frightened you," Miss Marple said gently. "He frightened everyone," Mrs. Porter replied. "He wouldn't let things rest." "Things at the lake?" Miss Marple asked.
Mrs. Porter's hands trembled slightly.
"You don't understand." "Then help me," Miss Marple said softly.
Mrs. Porter swallowed.
"Years ago, there was an agreement. Informal. Practical."
"About what?" Miss Marple asked.
"About waste," Mrs. Porter replied. "Runoff, disposal, things that were convenient."
Miss Marple nodded slowly.
"Leonard knew," Mrs. Porter continued. "He always knew. He helped arrange it."
"And later?" Miss Marple asked.
"Later he regretted it," Mrs. Porter said. "Said it wasn't right."
"And decided to speak," Miss Marple said.
"Yes," Mrs. Porter whispered. "He said the silence was killing us anyway."
That afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more along the lake's perimeter. The water glimmered deceptively clean. Birds skimmed its surface. Reeds whispered in the breeze. Yet beneath it all lay the consequences of convenience. Choices made quietly, justified easily, and defended collectively. She paused near the willow tree again. The scuff marks were clearer now that she knew what she was looking for. Leonard had not been surprised here. He had met someone who knew exactly what he intended to say. Inspector Graves joined her later, his expression grave.
"We've had reports," he said. "Old dumping permits, informal arrangements, nothing official."
"Shared responsibility," Miss Marple said.
"Shared guilt," Graves corrected.
"And shared fear," Miss Marple added.
That evening Miss Marple attended a small supper at Mrs. Ellery's home. Conversation circled carefully until Miss Marple spoke.
"Leonard Foyle believed silence was no longer an option," she said.
A chair scraped.
Miss Carver, the schoolteacher, stood abruptly.
"He had no right."
Miss Marple turned to her.
"No right to speak. No right to ruin lives," Miss Carver snapped. "Some of us weren't here when those decisions were made." "But you live with their consequences," Miss Marple said calmly.
Miss Carver's breath caught.
"I teach children by that lake."
Silence fell.
"And you discovered something," Miss Marple said gently. "Something Leonard intended to reveal."
Miss Carver sat down slowly.
"He told me the truth about the water, about the past." "And you advised him?" Miss Marple asked. "I begged him to stop," Miss Carver said, "to wait." "But he refused," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Miss Carver whispered.
That night, Miss Marple reviewed everything she had learned. Leonard Foyle had been part of the secret. He had turned against it.
The village depended on silence, which meant his death had not been personal, it had been collective. But collective fear still required an individual hand. Someone had met Leonard by the lake, not in anger, but in desperation. Someone who believed one voice could still be quieted, and someone who had underestimated how closely Miss Marple listened. Chapter 4. The Cost of Speaking. Miss Marple had always known that truth carried a price. What varied was not the cost itself, but who was expected to pay it. In Willowmere village, the bill had been postponed for years. Leonard Foyle's decision to speak had threatened to bring it due all at once. The morning after Miss Carver's outburst, the village felt altered. People moved more cautiously, as though any careless word might shatter an unspoken agreement. Doors were closed with greater care. Conversations halted the moment footsteps approached. Miss Marple noticed everything. She began her day with a walk along the eastern path, the one Leonard Foyle had taken so often. The grass had been flattened in places, worn by habitual passage. He had walked this way deliberately, Miss Marple thought. Not wandering, not uncertain. Purpose left patterns. At the footbridge she paused. The wood creaked faintly under her weight. From here the lake was visible through the willows, placid, inviting, deceptive. Inspector Graves met her there. "We've been going through old council records," he said. "There were complaints about the lake years ago. Fish dying, illness." "And nothing done," Miss Marple said. "Quietly dismissed," Graves replied. "Leonard helped smooth it over." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Until he didn't." They walked together toward the willow tree. "This is where he stopped," Miss Marple said. Graves nodded. "We believe someone intercepted him here." "And spoke calmly," Miss Marple added. "No struggle, no urgency." "That's what bothers me," Graves admitted. "Who argues about poison quietly?" "Someone who believes the listener will understand," Miss Marple said. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mr. Harold Keene again. This time he did not pretend ease. "I know what people are saying," he said tightly, "that I benefited from the silence." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," he replied.
So did everyone. "Did you meet Leonard by the lake that day?" Miss Marple asked. Keene hesitated. "I warned him." "When?" Miss Marple asked. "The evening before," Keene said.
"I told him speaking now would destroy livelihoods." "And he?" Miss Marple asked. "He said destruction was already happening," Keene replied bitterly. Miss Marple thanked him and left. That evening she visited Miss Carver. The school teacher looked exhausted. "I shouldn't have said anything," Miss Carver said. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "You should have said more, sooner." Miss Carver swallowed. "Leonard came to me because he trusted I would do the right thing." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked. "I told him to wait," Miss Carver said, "to give me time to prepare evidence." "And he refused," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Miss Carver whispered. "He said waiting was just another word for silence." Miss Marple nodded. That night, Miss Marple returned alone to Willowmere Lake. Moonlight lay across the water like a thin sheet of glass.
She walked slowly, counting steps, observing angles. Near the willow tree, she noticed something new, or rather, something that had been deliberately overlooked. A stone, smooth, heavy, not native to this part of the bank. She picked it up carefully. This was not a weapon of anger, it was a tool. Leonard Foyle had not fallen accidentally, he had been struck once, precisely enough to incapacitate, not to disfigure. His body had then been placed carefully, arranged to suggest peaceful collapse. Who would do such a thing? Someone who feared discovery but did not hate Leonard? Someone who believed necessity excused violence? Miss Marple straightened slowly. The killer was not acting alone in spirit, but only one person had chosen to act with finality, and that person had believed, wrongly, that silence could be enforced forever.
Chapter 4. Call to Action. Do you believe the killer acted out of fear for the village, or fear for themselves? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 5. Who walked with him? Miss Marple had always maintained that motive was the least reliable of guides. In villages especially, many people had reasons enough, resentments, fears, old grievances, but far fewer possessed the nerve, the opportunity, and the particular calm required to act decisively. Opportunity, she reflected, was often disguised as routine. Leonard Foyle's habits had been precise. He walked at nearly the same hour each afternoon, choosing familiar paths, stopping at predictable points along the lake. Anyone who wished to intercept him would not have needed imagination, only patience. Miss Marple set about reconstructing his final day. She began with time. At precisely 2:30, Leonard had left his cottage. Mrs. Ellery had seen him pass her gate. At 2:45, Mr. Harold Keene had encountered him near the footbridge. Shortly after 3, Miss Carver had spoken with him near the school lane. And at some point between then and 3:30, Leonard had reached Willowmere Lake and met his end. A narrow window. Miss Marple walked the route herself, step by measured step, timing the journey as Leonard would have done. She noted where paths converged, where hedges narrowed sightlines, where a person might wait without being seen. Near the willow tree, she stopped. From here, one could watch the eastern path and the lakeside track simultaneously. A person standing casually by the water would appear merely contemplative. Only someone who knew Leonard's routine would choose this spot. Inspector Graves joined her later, carrying a folded map. "We've confirmed something," he said. "Miss Carver left the school earlier than usual that day." Miss Marple looked up. "How much earlier?"
Nearly 40 minutes. And did anyone notice? Miss Marple asked. Not at the time, Graves said, but children remember odd things. Miss Marple nodded. Children, she knew, noticed what adults ignored. That afternoon she visited the school. The classroom was tidy, chalkboard wiped clean, desks aligned with careful precision. Miss Carver greeted her with visible strain. "I didn't kill him," she said immediately. Miss Marple sat calmly. "I didn't say you did." "But you're thinking it," Miss Carver insisted. "I'm thinking about who walked with Leonard," Miss Marple replied gently.
Miss Carver's breath caught.
He walked alone. Did he? Miss Marple asked. Miss Carver hesitated. I saw him near the path. We spoke briefly. And then? Miss Marple asked. And then he went toward the lake, Miss Carver said. I went home. Miss Marple studied her carefully. You went home by which route? She asked. Miss Carver's answer came too quickly. The upper lane. Miss Marple nodded. Of course. Later, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Porter again. Did you see anyone else that afternoon? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Porter frowned. I saw someone by the lake. Who? Miss Marple asked. I thought it was Leonard, Mrs. Porter said. But now, I'm not certain. Why? Miss Marple asked. Because the person stopped, Mrs. Porter said. Leonard never did. He always kept walking. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Someone had waited. That evening,
Miss Marple returned to the lake with Inspector Graves.
Leonard was struck once, she said, from behind, with a stone selected for weight and control.
Meaning? Graves asked.
Meaning the killer did not want noise, Miss Marple replied, or a struggle. They wanted silence preserved.
Who would Leonard listen to? Graves asked. Miss Marple answered quietly.
Someone he trusted enough to stop for.
They stood in silence for a moment. Graves spoke again. Miss Carver's shoes were damp that afternoon. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. From the lake? From the shallows, Graves confirmed. Miss Marple sighed softly. She went to persuade him one last time. And when persuasion failed, Graves asked. She chose the village, Miss Marple replied, over the truth. As night fell, Miss Marple returned home and sat by the window,
knitting idle in her lap. Miss Carver had not been part of the original secret, but she had inherited its burden. Teaching children by the lake, she had seen the consequences firsthand. She had believed silence was a temporary necessity until Leonard threatened to make it permanent by speaking. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, could make moral people do irreversible things. Yet something still troubled her. Miss Carver had motive. She had opportunity. But had she the composure? Miss Marple looked again at the smooth stone she had found. It was not chosen in panic. It was chosen deliberately. Someone had prepared. And preparation, she knew, belonged to someone older. Someone practiced in restraint. Someone who had lived with silence for years. Miss Carver set her knitting aside. The person who walked with Leonard had not been alone in spirit, but only one had decided how far silence must go. Chapter 5. Call to Action. Do you believe Miss Carver acted alone, or is someone else guiding events from the shadows? Share your theory below. Chapter 6. The Hand That Never Shook. Miss Marple slept poorly that night, not from fear. She had long since learned to put fear aside,
but from the quiet insistence of a detail that refused to settle. The smooth stone, the careful placement of Leonard Foyle's body, the absence of panic. These things did not belong to a moment of emotional collapse. They belonged to someone who planned. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over Willowmere Lake. Miss Marple rose early and walked toward the village, her steps slow and deliberate, her mind assembling the pieces once more. Miss Carver was an obvious suspect. She had motive. She had been present. Her shoes were damp. But Miss Marple could not escape the sense that Miss Carver's involvement, if any, had been secondary. Fearful, hesitant, not decisive. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak again with Mr. Harold Keene. She found him in his garden, trimming a hedge with meticulous care. The cuts were precise, evenly spaced, methodical. "You keep your garden beautifully," Miss Marple observed. "I believe in order," Keene replied without looking up. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "it shows." She watched his hands as he worked. They were steady, unhurried. They did not tremble, even when he noticed her watching. "Leonard trusted you once," Miss Marple said gently. Keene paused only briefly. "Leonard trusted many people." "But he argued with you," Miss Marple continued.
About the lake. Keene set the shears aside carefully. He misunderstood the situation.
"Did he?" Miss Marple asked. "He saw danger where compromise existed," Keene said calmly. "He was willing to destroy livelihoods for the sake of principle." "And you were willing to protect them," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Keene replied simply. Miss Marple nodded. "I wonder," she said softly, "when protection becomes possession." Keene met her gaze then, his expression unreadable. "You suggest too much, Miss Marple." "I observe," she corrected. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple met Inspector Graves near the lakeside path. "There's something you haven't told me," she said gently. Graves hesitated, then nodded. "We found Leonard's watch." "Where?" Miss Marple asked. "In Mr. Keene's boathouse," Graves said quietly.
Tucked inside a drawer. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly.
Leonard had not carried the watch into the water. It had been removed. "Keene says Leonard left it behind during an earlier visit," Graves added. "But the watch stopped at 3:20. The time Leonard died." Miss Marple opened her eyes. "And the stone?" "From the embankment near Keene's boathouse," Graves confirmed. "Same mineral composition." They stood together in silence. "Miss Carver?" Miss Marple asked. "Still claims she only tried to stop Leonard from speaking," Graves said. "Says Keene promised to handle it." Miss Marple sighed softly. There it was. Miss Carver had been frightened into inaction, persuaded that silence would be temporary, that someone older, steadier, more experienced would manage the problem. Mr. Keene. That evening,
Miss Marple requested a small meeting in the village hall. Nothing formal, just conversation. Keene arrived promptly. Miss Carver sat rigidly near the back. Mrs. Ellery and Mrs. Porter hovered nearby, uneasy. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Leonard Foyle believed silence had become dangerous," she said. "He chose to speak." She turned to Keene. "You chose to stop him," she said. Keene did not respond immediately. "You met him by the lake," Miss Marple continued. "You argued calmly. You struck him once, precisely, then arranged him carefully so the lake would appear responsible." Keene's voice was level when he spoke. He would have ruined everything.
You removed his watch, Miss Marple said. A habit, a small act of control. Keen's composure cracked, not violently, but visibly. I did what had to be done, he said quietly.
Someone had to. Miss Carver let out a sob. Inspector Graves stepped forward. I think, he said, that will be enough. As Keen was led away, Miss Marple felt no satisfaction, only sorrow, because the most dangerous crimes she knew were committed not by those who lost control, but by those who never did. Chapter 6. Call to Action. Do you believe Mr. Keen convinced himself he was protecting the village, or did he simply fear losing control? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 7. What Silence Protects. After Harold Keen was taken away, Willowmere Lake did not change. The water remained still. The reeds whispered as they always had. The willows dipped their branches into the shallows, indifferent to the truth that had finally surfaced beside them. It was the village that changed.
Miss Marple noticed it first in the pauses, those subtle hesitations that crept into conversations where none had existed before. People spoke more carefully now, choosing words as though they might bruise if handled roughly. Others spoke too much, filling the air with reassurance, with justifications, with the urgent need to explain themselves. Silence, once a shared habit, had become a liability. Miss Marple walked through the village that afternoon, observing the aftermath with quiet attention. Doors opened more slowly. Greetings felt strained. Eyes followed her in a way that was neither hostile nor friendly, but uneasy. At the grocer's shop, Mrs. Ellery stood behind the counter, hands folded tightly. "I never thought he would go that far," she said without preamble. "No one ever does," Miss Marple replied gently.
But we all knew, Mrs. Ellery continued, about the lake, about what Leonard planned to do. Yes, Miss Marple said, you knew. And we said nothing, Mrs. Ellery whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Silence often feels safer than action. Mrs. Ellery looked away. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the school. Classes had ended early. Children's voices echoed faintly from the playground, blissfully unaware of the tensions shaping their world. Miss Carver sat alone in the classroom, staring at the chalkboard as though answers might appear there. "I didn't mean for him to die," she said quietly when Miss Marple entered. "No," Miss Marple replied. "You meant for someone else to decide." Miss Carver flinched. "He said he would handle it." "And you believed him," Miss Marple said.
"Because belief relieved you of responsibility." Miss Carver's eyes filled with tears. "Leonard frightened me. He frightened all of us."
"Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But fear does not excuse the choice to remain silent." Miss Carver covered her face with her hands. That evening, Inspector Graves met Miss Marple near the lake one final time. "Keen's confession was thorough," he said. "He admits striking Leonard, arranging the scene, even removing the watch. Says he believed he was preventing greater harm." "Many people do," Miss Marple replied, "especially those accustomed to control." "And Miss Carver?" Graves asked. "She will carry her own burden," Miss Marple said, "as will the village." Graves nodded. "Not everything belongs in a courtroom." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but everything belongs somewhere." As twilight settled,
Miss Marple sat on a bench overlooking Willowmere Lake. The water reflected the fading sky, darkening gradually. A single ripple moved across the surface, then disappeared.
Leonard Foyle had lived quietly. He had participated in the silence until he could no longer endure it. His mistake, Miss Marple thought, had not been speaking, but believing that others would stand with him once he did. Communities, she knew, rarely changed all at once. They shifted slowly, reluctantly, shedding old habits only when forced. And Willowmere Lake had forced them. Miss Marple rose and walked back toward her lodging, the path lit faintly by the evening sky. Behind her, the lake remained silent, but the silence no longer belonged to safety. It belonged to memory, and memory, once awakened, was far harder to control. Chapter 7. Call to Action. Do you think the village bears responsibility for Leonard Foyle's death? Or does guilt rest only with the one who struck the blow? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 8. Ripples on Still Water. If the arrest of Harold Keene had shattered the village's long silence, the days that followed revealed just how fragile that silence had been. Willowmere Lake became the subject of careful avoidance. People no longer walked its paths casually. Those who did approached the water with hesitation, as though it might answer back if disturbed. Fishermen packed away their equipment. Mothers guided children along longer routes to school. The lake, once a symbol of calm, now carried a faint unease, an awareness that something hidden had been forced into the light. Miss Marple watched these changes with her usual attentiveness. She spent her mornings walking through the village, her pace unhurried, her greetings gentle. Some villagers welcomed her presence, others stiffened, uncomfortable under her mild gaze. At Mrs. Porter's house, she was offered tea that went untouched. "People are frightened," Mrs. Porter said quietly. "Not of the police, of themselves." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is often the harder fear." Mrs. Porter hesitated. "Leonard wasn't innocent, you know." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but he was honest. Eventually." That distinction mattered more than most realized. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to the lake itself. The water lay calm beneath a pale sky, reflecting the willows and reeds with deceptive serenity. She walked slowly to the spot where Leonard Foyle had died, and stood there for several minutes, her hands folded before her. The stone had been removed as evidence. The scuff marks had faded. Nature, efficient and indifferent, had begun erasing the signs of human error. Yet memory remained. Inspector Graves joined her shortly afterward. "The environmental inspectors are coming," he said. "They'll test the lake, the surrounding land. It won't stay quiet now." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Silence has lost its usefulness." Graves studied the water. "Some of them are angry at Leonard for forcing this." "Anger," Miss Marple replied, "is often fear dressed more loudly." They walked together along the bank. "He believed exposing the truth would save the village in the long run," Graves said. "And he was right," Miss Marple replied. "But courage rarely protects those who show it first." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Miss Carver. The schoolteacher sat amid stacks of papers and books, preparing lesson plans with meticulous care. "I'm leaving," Miss Carver said quietly. "I've accepted a post elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps a wise choice." "I told myself I was protecting the children," Miss Carver continued, "but I was protecting myself." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "That realization will stay with you." Miss Carver looked up, eyes glistening. "Do you think Leonard would forgive me?" Miss Marple paused. "Forgiveness," she said, "belongs to the living." That evening, the village held a small meeting, not an official one, but an earnest gathering in the hall. People spoke carefully, acknowledging the stakes without naming names.
Promises were made. Oversight committees proposed. Responsibility shared in language that softened its edges. Miss Marple listened from the back. It was not perfect, but it was movement. As night fell, she returned once more to Willowmere Lake. The moon reflected faintly on the surface, broken only by the occasional ripple. Miss Marple watched until the water stilled again. Silence had once protected the village. Now it guarded a different truth, that what was hidden could no longer remain so. Leonard Foyle's death had created ripples that would not fade quickly. They would touch every household, every routine, every comfortable assumption. Miss Marple turned away from the lake and walked back toward the village lights. Somewhere else, she knew, another quiet place would soon reveal its own secrets. Because silence, when relied upon too long, always betrayed those who trusted it. Chapter 8. Call to Action. Do you believe Leonard Foyle's choice to speak ultimately saved the village, or cost too much? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 9. The price of knowing justice, Miss Marple had often observed, rarely arrived with the clarity people expected. More often it came in fragments, official decisions here, private reckonings there, leaving communities to piece together meaning long after the law had spoken. Willowmere Village was entering that stage now. Harold Keene's case progressed quietly. There were no crowds at the courthouse, no dramatic accounts in the papers. The facts were straightforward enough. A calculated blow, an arranged scene, an attempt to preserve a secret that had grown too dangerous to protect. Keene admitted to striking Leonard Foyle, though he framed it as necessity rather than malice. Miss Marple read the brief notice in the local paper and folded it carefully. In the village, reactions were mixed. Some spoke of relief, others of betrayal. A few expressed sympathy for Keene, describing him as a man who had shouldered too much responsibility for too long. Miss Marple listened to these comments with her usual calm. Responsibility, she knew, was often claimed most loudly by those who decided unilaterally. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Ellery near the post office. "They say the lake will be closed," Mrs. Ellery said. "At least for now." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It must be examined properly." Mrs. Ellery sighed. "People are angry. About the inconvenience." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They always are." As they spoke, two men passed by, lowering their voices mid-sentence. Miss Marple caught only a fragment. If Leonard had kept quiet. Yes, she thought, if only. Later, Inspector Graves visited Miss Marple at her lodging. "The inspectors have confirmed it," he said. "Contamination. Not recent, but long-standing." Miss Marple nodded. "Leonard was right, then?" "Yes," Graves replied. "And wrong about how ready people would be to hear it." Graves hesitated. "Miss Carver has given a statement. She admits Keene told her he would handle the situation. She says she believed that meant persuasion, not violence." "Belief can be very convenient," Miss Marple said gently. "And yet," Graves continued, "she's not without consequence. Her role may not be criminal, but it isn't blameless." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Few roles ever are." That evening, Miss Marple walked through the village one last time. The lights in the cottages glowed softly. Curtains were drawn. The rhythm of life was returning, but altered,
subtly, like a melody played in a different key. She paused near the lake's path. A temporary fence had been erected, warning signs posted at intervals. The water beyond looked unchanged, reflecting the moon as it always had. Only the barrier suggested that anything was different. Miss Marple stood there for several minutes. Leonard Foyle had lived long with the weight of a shared secret. He had participated, regretted, and finally refused to continue. His death had not been dramatic, but it had been consequential. She thought of Miss Carver, preparing to leave, of Mrs. Ellery and Mrs. Porter, forced to confront their own silences, of Keene, who had believed himself the village's guardian. And she thought of the children, still playing, still laughing, unaware of the invisible costs that had shaped their world. Miss Marple returned to her room and began packing her things. As she folded her clothes, she reflected on the nature of knowledge. To know something dangerous, she believed, was not the same as being responsible for it. Responsibility began when one chose what to do with that knowledge. Leonard Foyle had chosen to speak. Others had chosen to stop him. And still others had chosen to look away. The village would live with all of those choices. In the morning, Miss Marple would leave Willowmere behind. But the lake, fenced and tested and scrutinized, would remain, its silence broken at last. As Miss Marple extinguished the lamp, she felt no satisfaction,
Only the quiet certainty that silence, once broken, could never be fully restored. And that was, perhaps, as it should be. Chapter 9. Call to Action. Do you think Leonard Foyle's death was the inevitable cost of revealing the truth? Or could the village have chosen differently? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 10. When Silence Finally Breaks. Miss Marple believed that endings revealed more about people than beginnings ever could. The morning she prepared to leave Willowmere was bright and deceptively ordinary. Sunlight touched the village rooftops, birds sang without hesitation, and the paths were swept clean as though nothing had ever disturbed their routine. Yet the village was not the same. The lake remained closed, its perimeter marked by temporary fencing and official notices. The water lay still behind the barriers, reflecting the sky as it always had. But now it was watched, measured, questioned. Silence had lost its authority. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the village green, her suitcase waiting by the door of her lodging. She had no need to hurry. Departures, like conclusions, were best approached calmly. Mrs. Ellery intercepted her near the post office. "I heard you're leaving today," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "My role here is finished." Mrs. Ellery hesitated. "I wanted to thank you." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "For what, exactly?" "For making us face it," Mrs. Ellery said. "Even if we didn't want to." Miss Marple nodded. "Truth rarely asks permission." As they parted, Miss Marple noticed something she had not seen before. A notice posted on the village board announcing a public meeting regarding environmental responsibility and oversight. The wording was careful, but the intent was clear. It was a beginning. Later that morning, Inspector Graves arrived to see her off. "Keene has been formally charged," he said. "He'll face sentencing in due course." "And the lake?" Miss Marple asked. "Long process," Graves replied, "but necessary." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Delayed consequences often are." They walked together toward the edge of the village. "You know," Graves said, "some people still say Leonard Foyle should have kept quiet." Miss Marple stopped walking. "Leonard Foyle?"
she said calmly, lived with the knowledge that silence was harming others. He chose to end that harm,
Even knowing it would make him unpopular. Graves nodded. And it cost him his life.
Yes, Miss Marple replied, but not his integrity. They stood in silence for a moment. That, Miss Marple added softly, is something many people never manage to keep. Before leaving, Miss Marple made one final visit to the lake. She approached the fence slowly, resting her gloved hand on the wooden post. Beyond it, the water shimmered faintly, disturbed only by a single ripple spreading outward before fading away. Leonard Foyle had stood here. He had faced someone he trusted, or once had, and believed that reason would prevail. He had underestimated how deeply fear had settled into the village's habits. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Communities, she reflected, were capable of great kindness and great cruelty, without ever raising their voices.
The most dangerous decisions were often made politely, reasonably, and with the best intentions. Harold Keene had believed he was protecting order. Miss Carver had believed she was protecting children. Others had believed they were protecting peace. And Leonard Foyle had believed that truth, once spoken, would be enough. Miss Marple turned away from the lake. The car was waiting at the end of the lane. As it carried her out of the village, she looked back only once. Willowmere lay quiet behind her, not silent, but watchful. The village would continue. It always did. But something essential had shifted. People would think twice now before agreeing to look away, before choosing convenience over conscience. Perhaps not everyone, but enough. As the road stretched ahead, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Somewhere else, in another place that seemed perfectly calm, someone was already trusting silence to protect them. And somewhere, she suspected, another truth was waiting, patiently, to be spoken. Call to action. Do you believe Leonard Foyle's decision to speak was worth the cost? And would you have done the same? Share your final thoughts in the comments below. And so, dear listener, our journey through Blackmere Conservatory comes quietly to its end. The glass corridors stand calm once more. The orchids bloom without witness. Reflections linger but no longer deceive. What was once a place of illusion has become a place of understanding, where beauty is paired with responsibility and openness is guided by care. This was not merely a mystery of how a killer vanished, but of why we so often trust what we see without question. In a world designed to display everything, Hercule Poirot reminded us that truth is not always hidden in darkness. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, protected by certainty, by routine, by the comfort of believing nothing could go wrong. Sir Alistair Pembroke believed exposure would correct imbalance. He was right, but at a cost he never imagined. And in the aftermath, Blackmere learned that transparency without conscience is fragile, while accountability, though uncomfortable, endures. If this story held you in its quiet tension, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which detail changed your suspicions? At what moment did the illusion finally break for you? Share your reflections and theories in the comments. And if you enjoyed this slow burn mystery, consider liking, subscribing, and joining us again. There are many places built of glass and certainty, each with secrets waiting to be seen clearly. Until our next case, rest well, watch closely, and remember, order returns not when illusions vanish, but when understanding remains.